Hitler never fully trusted anyone. He despised his allies and hated his enemies with equal intensity. In private meetings, he described Italians and Japanese as incompetent or unreliable, while proclaiming that only the German people were destined to dominate Europe. His worldview was based on rigid racial hierarchies. He considered the Soviets subhuman and the Jews the absolute enemy that had to be exterminated. He respected the British for their empire, but saw them as an obstacle to be destroyed. Even within his circle, distrust was constant. He feared betrayals and saw weakness in any gesture of doubt. How could a leader despise so much those who accompanied him in the war? To what extent did his prejudices influence the Axis alliances? Was it Hitler's arrogance that ultimately isolated him even from his own partners? The broken mirror, Mussolini under the shadow of the Reich. In the political trajectory of Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini played a central role during the ideological formation years of the German leader. The March on Rome, carried out at the end of October of 1922, was observed from Munich as the tangible demonstration that a mass movement with a paramilitary base could impose a new order without the need for prolonged parliamentary processes. Mussolini, at the head of his black shirts, had forced King Victor Emmanuel III to hand over power without the need for large military confrontations. Hitler interpreted that event as a lesson applicable to the German reality. The following year, in November of 1923, he organized the Munich Putsch, an attempt to emulate what happened in Italy. The coup failed and led him to prison, but the experience reinforced in him the conviction that the decisive action of a leader, backed by a partisan militia, could alter the course of a state weakened by economic and political crisis. During those years of learning, Hitler studied in detail the methods of Italian fascism. The use of symbols, the wearing of distinctive uniforms, and the staging of parades were elements adopted and replicated in Germany. The model of the black shirts inspired the creation of the Sturmabteilung, known as brown shirts. Radical nationalism, violent anti-communism, and street mobilization became common traits between both movements. Mussolini acted as an indirect reference, even though there was not yet any personal contact between the two leaders. The influence was more symbolic than practical, but it was visible in the aesthetics of the Nazi rallies, in the systematic use of violence against political opponents, and in the aspiration to build a total leadership capable of overcoming the limitations of the parliamentary system. Hitler saw in the Duce the demonstration that fascism could impose itself in a modern society of Western Europe. The first personal meeting took place in Venice in mid-June of 1934. By then, Hitler had already reached the chancellorship of the Reich and was consolidating his absolute power through the elimination of internal adversaries and the subordination of all state institutions. The meeting did not take place in a climate of trust. Mussolini considered him a politician of rough manners, without the cultural refinement he attributed to true leadership. Hitler, on the other hand, saw the Italian as a vain man, concerned with public image and without a rigorous commitment to fascist principles. The personal differences were reflected in the conclusions of both delegations. They agreed on hostility towards communism and rejection of liberal democracy, but they diverged in leadership styles and strategic priorities. Mussolini retained a certain respect for traditional forms of power, while Hitler leaned towards a complete break with the existing order. Despite those reservations, in the following years, a gradual rapprochement occurred, motivated by shared strategic interests. In 1938, Mussolini promulgated the Manifesto of Race, introducing anti-Semitic legislation in Italy and aligning his policy with that of Germany. For Hitler, this change removed one of the main obstacles to a firm alliance. Italian fascism was advancing towards positions closer to German National Socialism. In May of 1939, both governments signed the Pact of Steel in Berlin. The agreement established political and military cooperation in the event of conflict, creating a formal alliance between the fascist regimes. For Germany, Italy provided strategic resources in the Mediterranean and a valuable geographic location facing France and North Africa. For Mussolini, the alliance secured the Reich's backing in his ambitions over the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. However, the distrust remained. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Mussolini found out through the radio without having received prior notice. He feared that Italy was not prepared for a large-scale war, so he opted for an intermediate position defined as non-belligerence. This attitude irritated Hitler, who expected immediate and effective support from his ally. Tension increased in October of 1940 when Mussolini ordered the invasion of Greece without consulting Berlin. The operation sought to demonstrate strategic independence, but it turned into a military failure. The Greek resistance, reinforced by British troops, halted the Italian advance and organized counter-offensives that compromised the positions of the fascist army. The failure forced Hitler to divert troops to the Balkans to rescue his ally, delaying the preparation of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. For the Führer, this intervention confirmed the Duce's lack of strategic capability and his tendency to compromise the general Axis strategy for particular ambitions. Italy came to be considered more of a burden than an asset, although public rhetoric continued to present the alliance as fraternal. With the progress of the war, Hitler's perception of Mussolini deteriorated continuously. The Italian defeats in North Africa, which forced the intervention of the Afrika Korps, reinforced the idea that Italy lacked the resources to sustain a modern war. In his private circle, Hitler expressed that Italy should limit itself to supplying raw materials and labor, leaving Germany to lead strategic operations. The situation reached a critical point in 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July triggered an internal crisis that culminated with Mussolini's dismissal by the Grand Fascist Council and his arrest by order of King Victor Emmanuel III. For Hitler, that was a betrayal and a confirmation of the fragility of the Italian system. His reaction was immediate. He ordered the military occupation of a large part of Italy through Operation Axa and simultaneously organized Mussolini's rescue, led by Otto Skorzeny. In September of that year, the Duce was freed and moved to the north, where he established the Italian Social Republic, known as the Republic of Salo. This new government lacked real autonomy and depended completely on the Reich. Mussolini had gone from being an admired model to becoming a subordinate under German supervision. His figure, instead of representing the strength of fascism, symbolized its inability to hold power without external support. Nonetheless, Hitler valued his presence as a propaganda resource that maintained the appearance of a European fascist alliance. In the Nazi power circles, the possibility of completely dispensing with Italian collaboration and directly administering the territories was even discussed. Some hierarchs of the regime considered that the resources used to support the Salo regime were being wasted. Hitler, however, maintained formal support for the Duce, aware that it served to legitimize the continuation of the war as a common enterprise. The Republic of Salo became a weak symbol, supported only by the presence of German divisions. For Hitler, Mussolini was no longer the inspiring example of the 1920s, but the reflection of the fragility of fascism when facing overwhelming military pressure. In the conversations of the Führerbunker, the Duce was cited as a warning about the vulnerability of leaders who depended on external support to survive. While in northern Italy the partisan forces were expanding their control and the Allied troops were advancing, the Salo regime was disintegrating. Reports described local authorities switching sides according to the course of the war. Italy, which had been the origin of European fascism, was transforming into the demonstration of its decay and loss of legitimacy. The relationship between Hitler and Mussolini, which began as a bond of admiration and a model to follow, was ending in a unilateral dependence marked by distrust. That broken mirror of fascism stood as a warning sign in a conflict that had not yet reached its climax. Bitter Henday, Franco on the border of distrust. The relationship between Adolf Hitler and Francisco Franco began in the framework of the Spanish Civil War, which began in July of 1936. From the early weeks, the conflict attracted the direct attention of the Third Reich. For Hitler, Spain represented a strategic opportunity in the Mediterranean and at the same time an experimental stage to test new military doctrines. In that context, Franco appeared as a useful instrument to weaken the Spanish Republic, backed by leftist forces with support from the Soviet Union. At the end of July of that same year, just days after the military uprising, envoys from the Caudillo traveled to Germany seeking help. The main request was to facilitate the transport of troops from North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, a crucial move to consolidate positions on peninsular territory. Hitler received the proposal with some skepticism, as he perceived improvisation in the planning and a limited understanding of the logistics demanded by modern warfare. However, he decided to intervene. The supply of Junkers transport planes allowed the establishment of an air bridge that proved decisive for the transfer of Francois forces from Morocco to Andalusia. That initial support led to the arrival of the Condor Legion in October of 1936. With it, Germany ensured its direct influence in the conflict and found a real laboratory to test new tactics. The massive bombings carried out by the German Air Force, including the attack on Guernica in April of 1937, provided the Third Reich with valuable information on the destructive capacity of its air force in urban environments and on the psychological impact of sustained air attacks against the population. While Franco consolidated his military and political power, Hitler witnessed the effectiveness of methods that would later be applied in other European campaigns. Despite the decisive help, Hitler never considered Franco a leader of equal political or intellectual stature. In his private circle, he expressed clear contempt towards the Spanish, whom he described as undisciplined and ill-suited for modern military organization. To him, Spain lacked the industrial capacity and warlike tradition necessary to become a significant Allied power. Its only strategic value lay in the geographical location and the control of the Strait of Gibraltar, a vital point for British communications with the Mediterranean and the Middle East. After Franco's definitive victory in April of 1939, Hitler watched closely the process of consolidation of the new regime. He perceived in the ceremonial style and the exaltation of monarchical symbols a sign of conservatism rather than of true fascist revolution. Spain, devastated by 3 years of civil war, faced a ruined economy, destroyed infrastructure, and deep social divisions. Hitler understood that under those conditions, the regime could hardly become a strong military ally in the short term. The outbreak of the Second World War in September of that same year tested the relationship. Far from aligning with the Axis, Spain declared its neutrality and later adopted a policy of non-belligerence. For Hitler, this decision represented an implicit betrayal of the commitments acquired during the Civil War. He expected Franco to mobilize his resources against the United Kingdom, taking advantage of British weakness after the fall of France in June of 1940. Control of Gibraltar would have closed the Western Mediterranean to the British fleet, profoundly altering the naval balance. Franco's refusal to commit generated distrust in Berlin. In the high command meetings, Hitler lamented the lack of cooperation and criticized that the Caudillo prioritized national interests over ideological solidarity. This tension reached its peak at the Hendaye meeting held in October of 1940. Hitler personally traveled to the French-Spanish border to meet with Franco. He considered the negotiation essential to ensure Spanish participation in the war and the control of Gibraltar. The meeting dragged on for hours in a harsh atmosphere. Franco responded with evasive answers and demands that Hitler considered unacceptable: massive food supplies, arms deliveries, and colonial concessions in North Africa that interfered with the German agreements with Vichy France. Faced with the impossibility of meeting those demands, the meeting concluded without progress. Hitler's frustration was so intense that he confessed to Mussolini that he would prefer to endure physical pain rather than repeat a similar negotiation. After Hendaye, Hitler lost hope for a significant Spanish intervention. He continued to view Spain as an unstable country, at risk of new internal conflicts and lacking the material capacity to sustain modern military operations. He compared Franco's trajectory, who had come to power with the direct support of the armed forces and conservative sectors, to his own and Mussolini's, who had had to overcome more complex oppositions. In his view, Franco lacked the revolutionary mettle that defined fascism. With the advance of the World War, Spain kept its distance. There were limited gestures of collaboration, such as the sending of the Blue Division in 1941 to the Eastern Front, but there was no comprehensive commitment. For Hitler, this attitude confirmed the uselessness of the Franco regime as a strategic ally. Spain was reduced to a peripheral role, while the Third Reich faced the growing weight of the Allied coalition alone. That distancing highlighted the limitations of the fascist project as an exportable system. From Hitler's perspective, Spanish neutrality became a constant reminder that even among authoritarian regimes with a similar ideology, distrust and national interests could prevail over the rhetoric of unity. The meeting at Hendaye remained a symbol of a frustrated alliance, a turning point at which Axis diplomacy found an insurmountable limit in Franco's calculated caution. With that disagreement, the Mediterranean remained open to British influence, and the war scenario shifted to new fronts that would test the alliances already established. The broken pact, Stalin, and the betrayal that marked the East. The relationship between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin represented one of the most notorious contradictions of European politics in the 20th century. Both led opposing ideological systems, and yet for a brief period they achieved a convenience agreement that altered the political map of Eastern Europe. The paradox was evident. Hitler had pointed to Bolshevism as the absolute enemy since the 1920s, and at the same time considered the Slavic peoples racially inferior according to the National Socialist doctrine. The origin of this antagonism was clearly formulated in My Struggle, published in 1925. There, Hitler set out the doctrine of living space, which he conceived as a mandatory expansion to the east to ensure the survival of the German people. The fertile agricultural lands of Russia and Ukraine were seen as territories destined for German colonization, with the consequent expulsion, subjugation, or elimination of the local populations. This territorial vision was intertwined with the idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, interpreted as a global project aimed at destroying Western civilization. From this perspective, the Soviet Union occupied a permanent place in the category of the existential enemy. It was not a circumstantial adversary, but a rival that had to be completely eliminated at some point in the conflict. However, the dynamics of international politics led to an unexpected relationship. The first indirect clash between both regimes occurred in the Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939. Germany supported the nationalist rebels through the Condor Legion, while the Soviet Union sent advisors, tanks, and planes in favor of the Republic. The confrontation on Spanish territory anticipated the ideological dimension of the rivalry, but also highlighted that both regimes were willing to intervene beyond their borders to defend strategic interests. Despite this indirect confrontation, less than 2 years later, the two dictators surprised the world with the signing of a non-aggression pact. The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, signed in August of 1939, contained public clauses and secret protocols. The visible part committed both states to maintain neutrality in case one of them entered into war against third powers. What was truly decisive was found in the reserved agreement, the division of Eastern Europe into clearly defined spheres of influence. Stalin secured for the Soviet Union control of the Baltic countries, the region of Bessarabia, and part of Finnish territory, while Germany obtained freedom of action in Poland and Central Europe. This agreement allowed Hitler to launch the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939 without fearing a Soviet attack from the rear. In this way, he avoided the scenario of a two-front war that had proved fatal for Germany in the previous conflict. For Stalin, the pact meant an opportunity to expand Soviet influence westward while the capitalist powers wore each other out. Personally, Hitler felt towards Stalin a mix of ideological disdain and tactical respect. He considered him a brutal communist, responsible for the death of millions in purges and famines, but also recognized his ability to control a vast and heterogeneous state. He never stopped seeing him as an enemy who had to be destroyed, although he accepted his temporary usefulness as a strategic partner. In private circles, he described him as a shrewd player, capable of shifting his positions according to circumstances, but convinced that the final confrontation was inevitable. The alliance had an immediate benefit for Germany, the supply of Soviet raw materials that allowed it to withstand the British naval blockade. Between 1939 and 1941, the Soviet Union sent enormous amounts of grain, oil, cotton, and strategic metals. These resources supported the German military machinery and facilitated decisive campaigns, such as the offensive against France in the spring of 1940. Without this support, the pace of operations in the early years would have been much more difficult to maintain. The German perception of Soviet capability changed with the Winter War, which began in November of 1939 when the Soviet Union attacked Finland. The fierce resistance of the Finns, which caused disproportionate losses to the Red Army, led Hitler to conclude that Moscow was a colossus with feet of clay. In his analysis, an army that suffered such great difficulties against a smaller adversary could hardly resist a German attack planned with speed and precision. This episode reinforced the conviction that a campaign to the east could be resolved in a matter of months. Hitler interpreted Soviet weakness as confirmation of German superiority in organization and command. Meanwhile, Stalin continued expanding Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. In November of 1940, during Vyacheslav Molotov's visit to Berlin, Moscow's demands on Bulgaria and for permanent access to the Mediterranean caused strong tensions. After those negotiations, Hitler began to speak of Stalin as a blackmailer who increased his demands at every opportunity. He noted that a German victory over the United Kingdom would be intolerable for the Soviet Union, as it would irreversibly disrupt the European map. Consequently, he was convinced that beyond formal agreements, the confrontation with Moscow was only a matter of time. The relationship, sustained on circumstantial pragmatism, inexorably moved towards the rupture that would transform the course of the war. The distant enemy, Roosevelt as an invisible threat. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933 and Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency of the United States in March of that same year, both embodied different responses to the international crisis caused by the Great Depression. Germany sought a path of nationalist authoritarianism with a single-party structure and absolute concentration of power in a personal figure, while the United States promoted a strategy of state intervention in the economy but kept democratic institutions intact. From the beginning, Hitler closely observed the measures that Roosevelt implemented in his country. The New Deal, with its extensive federal government intervention in key sectors, was striking to the German Chancellor. He saw in it a confirmation that classical economic liberalism was in crisis, and that only states endowed with extraordinary authority could respond to historical circumstances of economic collapse. In his view, Roosevelt had built a model of control that, although not identical to National Socialism, coincided in moving away from traditional liberal capitalism. In various conversations with diplomats and advisors, Hitler commented that the American president was applying within his own institutional framework a form of economic dirigism that had certain parallels with what was experienced in Europe. However, this initial perception of relative recognition did not hide the fundamental difference between both systems. Roosevelt governed under a pluralistic and competitive electoral scheme with opposing parties, an active parliament, and an independent judiciary. The Third Reich, on the other hand, was sustained by the total exclusion of political adversaries, the prohibition of party competition, and the concentration of power in the figure of the Führer. From Hitler's perspective, there could be tactical coincidences in economic management, but there was an ideological boundary that made real convergence impossible. The tension began to become evident in 1939, when Roosevelt adopted a firmer tone in the face of German expansion in Central Europe. On the 14th of April of that year, he sent a simultaneous letter to Hitler and Benito Mussolini, asking for guarantees that they would not attack 31 European and Asian countries. The stated aim was to reduce tension and preserve peace. 2 weeks later, in a speech before the Reichstag, Hitler responded by reading aloud the list of nations while the Nazi deputies laughed loudly after each name. The scene was understood worldwide as a direct mockery of the American president and as an open challenge to North American diplomacy. After the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939 and the subsequent declaration of war by Great Britain and France, the United States officially maintained a position of neutrality. That policy reflected both the entrenched isolationism of American society and the tradition of the Monroe Doctrine, which historically limited intervention in European affairs. For Hitler, that neutrality was an opportunity. With the United States on the sidelines, Germany had the freedom to consolidate its continental conquests. Evolution changed gradually in 1940. Roosevelt promoted the program called Cash and Carry, which authorized the sale of arms and supplies to countries at war under two conditions: immediate payment and transport in the buyer's own ships. This measure formally maintained neutrality but clearly benefited Great Britain, which controlled the Atlantic maritime routes. Hitler watched with growing distrust the course of American policy, although he still did not consider it a direct threat. The definitive break came in March of 1941 with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act. Through this mechanism, the United States began to massively supply weapons, planes, ships, and ammunition to Great Britain, and after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, also to Moscow. For Hitler, this decision was equivalent to the effective entry of the United States into the war under a disguised legal appearance. The German war machine now had to face not only the British industrial capacity, but also the almost unlimited resources of the American continent. In Nazi propaganda, Roosevelt was increasingly presented as an instrument of international Jewish interests. Hitler maintained in his private and public speeches that American foreign policy did not respond to Washington's interests, but to the manipulation of Jewish bankers and capitalists who sought to destroy Germany. This conspiratorial interpretation became a central axis of the National Socialist view of the United States and consolidated the transformation of the American president from a distant interlocutor to an absolute enemy. The radical shift occurred after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Although Japan acted on its own initiative, Hitler interpreted that the opening of a new front in the Pacific could serve the Axis's interests. Convinced that the United States could not sustain a prolonged war on two fronts at the same time, he believed that the American entry weakened the Allies more than Germany. His judgment was based on ideological prejudices. He saw the democracies as weak regimes incapable of sustaining long-term war efforts. 4 days after the attack, on the 11th of December, Germany formally declared war on the United States. The decision was made unilaterally, without any prior military action from Washington against German interests. Hitler justified his measure before the Reichstag by accusing Roosevelt of having ordered covert attacks against German submarines in the Atlantic and of conspiring with Great Britain to draw his country into the conflict. The true motivation lay in political calculation. He hoped that the entry of the United States would consolidate a global war and disperse the Allied forces on multiple fronts. The result was contrary to his expectations. The United States, with its enormous industrial and demographic potential, quickly became the main engine of the Allied coalition. Supply convoys crossed the Atlantic with naval escort, material aid flowed to the Soviet Union via Arctic and Persian routes, and military operations in North Africa began to change the course of the war. The American economy, mobilized in record time toward war production, surpassed in manufacturing capacity that of all the Axis nations combined. Hitler had calculated that American democracy lacked the cohesion to sustain a long war. In practice, Roosevelt managed to unite society around a war effort of historic proportions. The miscalculation was evident. Germany was now facing not only the armies of Great Britain and the Soviet Union, but also the largest industrial power in the world. Hitler's perception of Roosevelt evolved in parallel with these events. From an initial recognition for certain economic measures, it turned into a complete demonization. In his final speech about the United States, Roosevelt was described as a politician manipulated by Jewish bankers, an absolute enemy whose existence justified the prolongation of total war. This image, amplified by Nazi propaganda, contributed to consolidating the German narrative of resistance against a global coalition supposedly led by international conspiratorial interests. The full entry of the United States into the war transformed the dimension of the conflict and irreversibly altered the global balance. Hitler had believed he could dominate the European continent without direct American intervention. Instead, he found himself facing a global war in which the logistical, naval, and air capacity of the United States would be decisive for the following years of confrontation. The figure of Roosevelt, initially observed with some interest, became the symbol of the most powerful adversary that the Third Reich would have to face: the indomitable Churchill against the power of the Reich. From the first steps of the National Socialist regime in Germany, Adolf Hitler found a constant opponent in Winston Churchill. Even before the Führer achieved absolute power, the British politician, then a parliamentarian without direct ministerial responsibilities, publicly warned about the danger that the National Socialist ideology represented for the stability of the European order established after the Great War. During the 1930s, when the official policy of appeasement towards Berlin prevailed in London under the Conservative governments, Churchill insisted from his seat in Westminster that Hitler was systematically preparing for a large-scale war, and that any territorial or political concession strengthened his military capabilities. His speeches in the House of Commons and his journalistic articles maintained an alarmist tone that contrasted with the optimism of those who trusted in diplomacy and agreements. These early warnings led Hitler to consider him a warmongering politician, incapable of accepting the reality of a Germany that demanded a central place in Europe. While Neville Chamberlain sought to negotiate through concessions, Churchill denounced the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the demands on Czechoslovakia as calculated steps towards a continental war. In Nazi propaganda, Churchill was described as an imperialist agitator, a representative of the old British colonial order incapable of recognizing the vitality of the new Germany. He was portrayed as a defender of a decaying system, obsessed with maintaining imperial privileges in the face of a Reich that, according to the official discourse, embodied the political and social modernity of the 20th century. Between 1936 and 1938, Hitler made several attempts to draw the United Kingdom into a position of neutrality or even collaboration. His strategy was to divide the areas of global influence. Germany would reorganize Eastern Europe, and Great Britain would keep its empire in Asia and Africa intact. An alliance of that kind would have given Germany the security of not facing a naval blockade and the freedom of action necessary to advance eastward. However, Churchill remained steadfast in rejecting any approach. For him, an agreement with Germany meant abandoning the European allies and accepting German hegemony over the continent. He considered that this option was incompatible with British security in the long term. Consequently, Hitler began to perceive him as an uncompromising enemy, driven not by legitimate interests, but by personal hostility towards Germany. In his inner circle, Hitler accused him of acting under the influence of international financial interests and Jewish groups that, in his conspiratorial view, controlled British politics. This interpretation reinforced the personal nature of his antagonism towards Churchill, distinct from that which he maintained with other European leaders. The direct confrontation began with the Battle of Britain in the summer and fall of 1940. After the defeat of France in June, Hitler hoped that London would negotiate an armistice. He believed that the United Kingdom would have no reason to prolong an unequal conflict. He then ordered a massive air offensive against industrial centers and civilian populations, trusting that sustained bombing would break British morale in a few weeks. The strategy was based on previous experiences in Poland and France, where air attacks had disorganized the resistance. However, the British Royal Air Force, with the decisive support of radar, withstood the assaults of the Luftwaffe. The losses of German aircraft and pilots exceeded expectations, while the British industry maintained the production rate. Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion plan, was postponed and finally cancelled. For Hitler, the failure was due to Churchill's obstinacy, who had rejected any negotiation despite the suffering endured by the civilian population. In May of 1941, a particular episode accentuated the hostility. Rudolf Hess, deputy of the Nazi Party, flew to Scotland on an unauthorized mission with the aim of proposing a separate peace agreement. Churchill ordered his immediate arrest and dismissed any negotiation. Hitler interpreted the action as a betrayal by Hess and as confirmation that Churchill would never accept an agreement that did not involve German surrender. The Führer's subsequent reactions were of fury. In meetings with his high command, he described Churchill as an absolute obstacle to peace in Europe. He considered that his persistence had frustrated every possibility of reaching an understanding, and that his hostility did not respond to rational political reasons, but to personal animosity and international conspiratorial interests. With the progress of the war, Hitler saw his worst fear materialize: the alliance between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. The union of a liberal democracy, a capitalist power, and the Soviet communist state was incomprehensible in his doctrinaire vision. He believed that those internal contradictions would disintegrate the coalition in little time. The fact that it remained stable was attributed to the political and diplomatic skill of Churchill. The British Prime Minister managed to maintain a cohesive alliance that combined world-scale industrial resources, extensive military capacity, and long-term political will. In Berlin, it was recognized that, without Churchill's insistence, that coalition would not have had the same firmness. Hitler identified him as the principal architect of the resistance against Germany and, therefore, as the most dangerous enemy of his regime. Nazi propaganda then intensified the personal attacks. Churchill was presented as a decrepit politician clinging to a declining empire. However, the reality showed that under his leadership, Great Britain not only had resisted alone in the most difficult year, but had also managed to attract the United States and consolidate cooperation with the Soviet Union. Churchill's ability to keep such disparate allies united was seen by Hitler as an even greater threat than the military victories on the different fronts. In this context, the relationship between both leaders acquired a personal character. Hitler did not consider him simply a political adversary, but the symbol of the global resistance to National Socialism. Churchill, on the other hand, saw in Hitler the existential threat against which he had warned for years. The clash of both figures represented, at its core, the confrontation between two irreconcilable visions of the future of Europe and the world. As the war dragged on, Hitler focused his disdain on the figure of the British Prime Minister, whom he accused of manipulating Roosevelt and artificially maintaining an alliance with Stalin. Churchill's persistence in keeping up the fight and rejecting any surrender was interpreted as an act of irrational obstinacy. To him, the British leader had embodied the most absolute hostility towards the Reich. The image of Churchill as an unyielding enemy was consolidated in the years of total war. The failure of prior negotiations, the German defeat in the Battle of Britain, and the consolidation of the Great Alliance came together in Hitler's mind as proof that the British Prime Minister was not only a political adversary, but the direct responsible party for the coalition that was encircling Germany. That perception would accompany the Führer's view of his rival until the end, marking one of the most intense personal confrontations of the entire Second World War. The Alliance of Necessity, Hirohito, and the Pact with Japan. The relationship between Adolf Hitler and Emperor Hirohito constituted one of the most evident paradoxes of Axis politics. According to National Socialist ideology, Asian peoples were considered racially inferior within the hierarchy established by the regime. However, the strategic demands of the war led Hitler to accept a formal alliance with Imperial Japan. That contradiction between racial dogma and military necessity defined the perception that the Führer had of Hirohito throughout the conflict. Hitler knew little about the emperor's personality. There was never any direct contact between them, no personal interviews, nor any significant exchange of letters. His image of Hirohito was formed through diplomatic reports and official communications sent by the Chancellery. In his eyes, the emperor was less a concrete individual than the symbolic representation of an Asian power capable of complicating the position of the United States and Great Britain in the Pacific. The geographical distance reinforced that abstract view. In the German mindset, Western stereotypes about the East prevailed, and Hitler was no exception. He saw Hirohito as a sovereign surrounded by archaic rituals, leading a disciplined society but culturally alien to the European model. That perception, limited by prejudices, did not prevent him from recognizing the strategic usefulness of Japan on the international chessboard. During the 1930s, Berlin observed with attention the Japanese military expansion in China. The Sino-Japanese War was seen by Hitler as a regional conflict that could distract resources from the Western powers, particularly from Great Britain and the United States. At that time, Japan was not considered a natural ally, but an actor whose action could temporarily coincide with the Reich's interests. The formal approach began with the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact in November of 1936. Officially directed against communist expansion, it actually sought to create a simultaneous pressure front on the Soviet Union from Europe and from Asia. For Hitler, this pact was less an ideological alliance than a diplomatic tool intended to influence Stalin's moves. The racial contradiction was resolved by classifying the Japanese as honorary Aryans, a pragmatic formula designed to justify the alliance without openly renouncing the doctrinal principles of the regime. In private, Hitler expressed some admiration for the discipline of the Japanese army and the organizational capacity of their society, although he always emphasized that these were qualities inherent to an Asian people and not comparable to the supposed superiority of the Europeans. On September 27, 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the tripartite pact in Berlin, which officially established the formation of the Axis. For Hitler, the incorporation of Tokyo represented the guarantee that Western enemies would have to divide their resources on different fronts. Japan ensured pressure in Asia and the Pacific, while Germany concentrated its efforts in Europe. In practice, however, the coordination between Berlin and Tokyo was minimal. Hitler did not consult the Japanese before launching Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, despite the fact that the opening of an Eastern Front directly affected the Axis's overall strategy. Japan, for its part, maintained a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union until the last days of the war, refusing to open a second front that would have alleviated the pressure on Germany. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 was received in Berlin with enthusiasm. Hitler interpreted it as Japan's definitive entry into the global war and as a blow that would force the United States to concentrate its effort in the Pacific. 4 days later, he declared war on Washington, confident that the conflict would disperse into multiple theaters. He had not been informed in advance of the Japanese plans. His decision was based on his own calculations, not on effective coordination with Tokyo. The initial victories of Japan in the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies reinforced in Hitler the idea that the emperor was fulfilling his role within the common strategy. However, the defeats of Midway and Guadalcanal revealed the limits of Japanese capability against American industrial power. As the war progressed, Hitler became frustrated by the lack of coordination and the absence of a Japanese offensive against the Soviet Union. In his reflections of the past few years, he saw Hirohito as a distant ally whose usefulness had been partial. He acknowledged that Japan had extended the war on a global scale, but regretted that it had not fully subordinated its national interests to the Axis strategy. He considered that the decisions of the emperor and his government were dominated by a traditionalist logic that prevented understanding the magnitude of the global confrontation. Ultimately, Hirohito occupied in Hitler's mind the position of a necessary but never trustworthy partner. The alliance with Japan was an alliance of necessity, useful for expanding the horizons of the war, but unable to provide the decisive advantages that the Führer had anticipated. That perception would mark the final assessment of the bond between Berlin and Tokyo as the Third Reich was heading towards its final defeat. The sunset, the final perceptions in the bunker. In April of 1945, when the Soviet forces were tightening the siege on Berlin and the Third Reich was reduced to poorly defended territorial fragments, Adolf Hitler remained in the underground complex of the Führer bunker, accompanied by his closest circle. Isolated from the outside world, he received increasingly incomplete reports on the general military situation. In that environment of confinement and imminent collapse, he expressed his final assessments of the international leaders with whom he had interacted during the war. Those perceptions were recorded in the notes of Joseph Goebbels, in the later observations of Martin Bormann, and in the memories of officers and officials who remained in the bunker until the last days. In them, a picture dominated by resentment, disappointment, and an absolute distrust towards all the political actors of his time is observed. No one escaped his bitter judgment, neither former allies nor enemies. The execution of Benito Mussolini on the 28th of April of 1945 profoundly impacted Hitler. The Duce, who in the 1920s had been a political model for the young German leader, was captured by Italian partisans when he was trying to flee towards Switzerland. Together with Clara Petacci, he was summarily executed in the north of Italy. Their bodies were taken to Milan, publicly displayed and mistreated by an enraged crowd. When the news reached the bunker, Hitler understood that a similar fate awaited him if he was captured alive. According to Goebbels' notes, he stated that he would not allow under any circumstances a comparable public humiliation. That conviction reinforced his definitive decision to put an end to his life before being taken prisoner. In his last reflections, Mussolini became for Hitler the example of the fragility of political power in the face of military defeat. The contrast between the march on Rome and the corpse hanging in Milan symbolized, in his view, the ruin of European fascism. What had once been inspiration was transformed into a warning. About Francisco Franco, his references were less frequent but equally revealing. He described him as an opportunist who had managed to stay out of the world conflict. He acknowledged that the Caudillo had obtained German support during the Civil War, but accused him of not reciprocating with any commitment in the decisive years of the European War. For Hitler, Franco represented calculated neutrality, a pragmatic attitude he morally despised but at the same time had to admit as effective. Spain had avoided devastation and kept the Franco regime intact while the fascist dictatorships of Italy and Germany were collapsing. In that contrast, Hitler saw confirmed the strategic usefulness of the non-belligerence adopted by Madrid, although he considered it a betrayal of the spirit of Hendaya. Joseph Stalin occupied a central place in the Führer's final comments. He characterized him with derogatory terms that reflected immutable racial prejudices, but implicitly admitted that he had demonstrated a capacity for resilience and leadership that exceeded his initial calculations. Hitler never abandoned his conviction that Bolshevism was an ideology destined to destroy European civilization. However, in the final weeks he acknowledged that Stalin had managed to keep a vast and diverse state cohesive, lead it to military victory, and bring the Red Army to the gates of Berlin. That combination of ideological contempt and tacit respect differentiated him from the rest of his enemies. In Hitler's view, the Soviet leader had managed to assert himself thanks to the regime's iron discipline and the massive material support provided by Great Britain and the United States. To him, Soviet resistance was not the product of individual qualities, but of the despotic nature of the system and the help received from outside. However, the objective fact was that Stalin had become the most evident political and military winner of the conflict, a situation that Hitler could not ignore in his final reflections. The figure of Franklin Delano Roosevelt appeared during those days of confinement, marked by the continuity of the conspiratorial vision that Hitler had maintained from the beginning. The American president had passed away on the 12th of April of 1945, but the news did not change his perception at all. For Hitler, Roosevelt had always been an instrument manipulated by international financial interests and what he called the worldwide Jewish influence. In his conception, he was not an independent leader acting on behalf of his country's national interests, but a cog in a political machinery that transcended individuals. The death of the American president did not represent, in his analysis, any strategic change. He considered that the power structure of the United States ensured the continuity of the war, regardless of the identity of the leader. He saw in this the confirmation that the American enemy did not depend on specific individuals, but on structural forces that would persist until the final destruction of the Reich. Winston Churchill remained, even in the final days, the most hated enemy. Hitler described him as an incurable, stubborn figure who had systematically prevented any peace agreement and had turned Great Britain into the core of international resistance. He accused him of being the main person responsible for the alliance that united Roosevelt and Stalin against Germany, a political achievement he considered decisive for the German defeat. In the bunker, his words against Churchill were particularly virulent. He characterized him as a manipulative politician, shrewd in building coalitions and capable of keeping his country in a war that, according to Hitler's view, did not align with long-term British interests. His hatred was personal and unalterable. He saw in the British Prime Minister the personification of the Western refusal to recognize the legitimacy of German aspirations. Beyond these judgments about foreign leaders, what dominated in the bunker was an atmosphere of widespread distrust. Hitler suspected the loyalty of his own collaborators, accused his generals of deliberate incompetence, and saw potential betrayals in every gesture. That atmosphere of paranoia reflected the absolute isolation in which the regime found itself. The war was lost, but the Führer persisted in explanations based on betrayals, conspiracies, and the supposed irrational obstinacy of his enemies. The twilight of the Third Reich was marked thus by the transformation of international figures into symbols of failure, betrayal, or insurmountable threat. Mussolini represented the fragility of defeated fascism, Franco, the pragmatic survival, Stalin, the inevitably triumphant enemy, Roosevelt, the embodiment of an incomprehensible economic power, and Churchill, the irreducible hostility. In the confined space of the bunker, these final perceptions formed a portrait of defeat and resentment that accompanied Hitler in his last days, setting the stage for the imminent outcome that would seal the end of the National Socialist regime in Europe.